A very warm welcome, everybody, to our second part of B Corp Battle Stories, an investigation into the history of B Corp in terms of the legislation behind it, the application today by the companies that try to be certified in B Corps, and also a potential international expansion into various jurisdictions from the original benefit corporation in the US. And for the second part, I'm very proud and glad to be joined again by Bill Clark, one of the godfathers of the B Corp movements, or the benefit corporation movements, if I can call it that way. Bill, fantastic to have you here again.
Thank you. It's a delight to be back, Otti.
Yeah, for our second part, and we made lots of teasers last time in terms of the continuation of the conversation. So let me just very briefly, as always, remind people where this comes from. So this is part of our Good Organizations Laboratory, and in particular the Business for Humanity inquiry series, where we're trying to figure out what a good organization, a responsible organization in the 21st century actually means, and how organizations can become better, with a capital B, so to speak, in playing their full role in making not only the organization itself, but also the stakeholders and the broader society flourish. Anything, if you're interested in this agenda, anything else you can read up on Business for Humanity or leadershipsociety.world. I'm not going to dwell on this because we have explained this in the first part. I will, however, again briefly introduce Bill. So Bill Clark is, as I already mentioned, one of the instigators of benefit corporation in the US, but beside that, an experienced attorney in corporate law, business law, and of course, benefit corporations. Not only did it play a very significant role in drafting all the statutes that we discussed last time to enable the formation of benefit corporation in US states, but he's also continuing to be a very important and influential advisor to the global B Corp movements in regards to expanding legislation nationally and internationally. And as we mentioned last time, what I found intriguing in Bill's history, not only his legal studies and being the former chair of the Pennsylvania Bar Association and Philadelphia Bar Associations, but the fact that Bill also brings a degree from the Westminster Theological Seminary. So I think we're trying to bring together the best of both, best of two worlds, which are often seen in competition, so to speak, the kind of the good principles from Christian teaching with the legal aspects of business. And last time, if you have watched the first part of our conversation, otherwise please do so, we've delved a little bit, we delved into the origins and the evolution of benefit corporations as an alternative, or as a first alternative really, to traditional corporate structures which are centered on stakeholder primacy. Bill explained how the model redefines corporate purpose to integrate financial profitability with kind of the material and positive impact on society. And we talked a little bit about the differences between benefit corporations and other, sometimes similar or traditional forms of corporations. We also then looked already at some of the battle stories in terms of the legislative process, looking at the role of bar associations, advocacy, lobbying, the championing for benefit corporations in different states. And we look at Maryland and Vermont and North Dakota and Michigan, and also some of the potential resistance. And I think we finished off the first conversation with Bill suggesting that in terms of the lobbying process, one of the most important points was to be involved very early. So basically we covered the points 1 to 3 on our agenda. And today we're going to focus on number 4 and 5, which is, now that we have benefit corporations, how do they work in practice? What's the role of B-Lab? What's the role of certification? What does it mean in terms of monitoring the statutes or the commitment to the public good? And then we're going to go into a little bit of critical analysis to say, okay, having lived through all this over the last decades, what's the gap between the original plan, the actual world, and where could this take us? So that's the plan for today. I'm going to take away the agenda, and I'm going to start us off, Bill, directly with giving the word back to you. So if we now look at the implementation, or the way that the the legal statutes have been implemented in real life. How many B Corps have we got today? Which countries or which states are leading? Is there any reason why? Do we have a focus on small or large companies, shareholder, non-shareholder? What's a little bit the picture in terms of how well this legislation has been adopted?
Yeah, so if we're looking at the legislation as opposed to the number of companies that are actually certified as certified B Corps, it's somewhat difficult to give you a good number. One of the things we realize now in hindsight is that we should have included in the legislation a provision that the filing office in each state would keep statistics on how many companies are formed under the law. Unfortunately, we did not do that. So the best we can do is try to estimate. Not surprisingly, our sense is that Delaware has seen a lot of companies using its statute. I think it's probably fair to say that California would be seeing a lot of companies using its statute as well. In the case of California, it reflects the fact that it's the largest economy in the United States among the states. Delaware, of course, is very popular for purposes of organizing and incorporating a business. So that would be my guess. Latest statistics suggest several thousand companies have used the Delaware statute. I would imagine it's similar in California. But unfortunately, Otti, I cannot give you better numbers.
And this is the benefit corporation without the certification.
I was just speaking about benefit corporations. There are over 9,000 companies that have been certified around the world. Those numbers are changing, obviously, constantly, but a running tally is kept on the website of B-Lab, so you can always go and check, and you can search and identify certified B Corps by country and by industry. So there's a lot more information available on the certified side of things.
So here we're starting to bridge between your point from last time that we need to really differentiate the B Corp from the benefit corporation part, right? So
yes.
Maybe let's go into that for a second. What is the difference in if you look at it from the spirit of the legislation, from what it says in the statutes, and what is emphasized in the certification? How would you characterize the differences, and ultimately, why should I certify beyond being a benefit corporation?
All right, so several questions that you asked there. Most basically, the benefit corporation corporate form is a creation of state law. So it actually changes how the legal system looks at companies that have elected that status. This certification is a private certification. So it is a very different approach to how a company operates, but the underlying goal, I would say, is essentially the same. So the purpose of the benefit corporation statute is to encourage companies to focus on their environmental and social impact at the same time they're running their economic activity and conducting their business. And the certification also looks at how a business is conducted, but the certification is through the lens of a set of standards that B-Lab has prepared that measure all the various aspects of environmental and social performance. So in a sense, it's much easier to become a benefit corporation because all that is required is that the company change its articles of incorporation that are publicly filed and elect the new status. That, of course, only begins the process, and that you would assume that a company that has elected the status is then committed to moving forward with implementing the statute. On the other hand, the certification requires a company seeking certification to actually demonstrate that it has put into practice and is creating social and environmental impact. So the purpose of the certification is really to verify that the performance of the business already meets a level that's defined by the standards that entitles the business to be called a certified B corporation. So it's a very different approach, but the two are aimed at the same goal, which is to promote and encourage responsible social behavior by businesses as they conduct their affairs.
Excellent. Maybe I've got two questions, but I'm going to ask them separately this time rather than accumulating. The first is about the history of B-Lab and where it comes from. But I want to ask another question first in terms of reinforceability of the statute. So what are the means to enforce or validate the compliance with a benefit corporation statute? And is this where this argument about standing to sue comes into play?
There are two principal ways in which the statutes are designed to be enforced. One is through a lawsuit, and the other is through an obligation that the company publicly report on its performance. And the two options vary state to state. Generally, the statutes provide that only the shareholders and the directors can institute a lawsuit to challenge the performance of the company. Many of the statutes permit a company to agree in its articles of incorporation that other groups will have standing to challenge them. I have never seen a company that has voluntarily agreed to be subject to a lawsuit by a community group or an environmental organization. And I think the reason for that is that most businesses believe that the people that have the most stake in the success of the company are the owners. Employees come and go, environmental groups have their attention, focused on a particular problem, but then they may move focus, they may move on to another company or to another issue, and they don't really have at stake a real interest in the company that they might want to bring a lawsuit against. So it's generally thought that that's inappropriate to give them standing. But the shareholders do have more of a stake in the operation. And obviously the directors do as well, although generally, if a director has a problem with the performance of a company, they're more likely to quit if they're unsuccessful in the boardroom and trying to change the behavior internally.
Whereas, of course, that brings to mind the whole Mecklen-Jensen, Chicago school debate about principal agency discussions, right? Where the old idea was that the stakeholder bear the biggest risk. But I think what we're seeing in a financialized capitalism is that very often the employees, the communities, even the customers bear much greater risks than financial investors, which just hop on and off of the company. But of course, in a benefit corporation, that should not be the case. And maybe then the fact that not so many benefit corporations are publicly shareholder owned is an argument in that case.
Yes, I would agree with that. To a certain extent, the way the benefit corporation statutes are set up is a reflection of political reality and a judgment that it was more important to create a model that businesses would actually be interested in using. We talked about the possibility of providing mandatory standing for these other groups. And honestly, we concluded that if we were to do that, we would severely limit the attractiveness of the benefit corporation statute and largely be doing something that was self-defeating.
Yeah, but isn't it a little bit still unsatisfactory insofar as I'm making a voluntary commitment to serve society, but I'm unwilling to be tested by the society upon my commitment? I cannot really imagine a situation where I'm making, so to speak, a public what's that, almost, I don't want to say oath, but that kind of covenant, and then are not to be tested. It sounds like Turkey's voting for Christmas, even if I understand that the assumption is that the owners are the good people in this unfolding drama.
Yes, and we recognized that we needed some way of verifying or providing substance to the model and the performance of the business, which is why all of the statutes do have a requirement that a company report on its performance. And that's largely consistent with the general approach in United States law to corporate governance generally, right? The theory behind our securities laws is for the government not to regulate substantively, but regulate and make sure that there is adequate and appropriate disclosure. And then it will be left to the marketplace, whether that's the securities law marketplace or the more general commercial marketplace, to regulate.
Yeah. I don't know whether this comply or explain notion has really helped us, for example, in the banking crisis and other crises that we've seen. But yes, that is certainly the predominant thinking. Would you, if there was in any jurisdiction a correlation with tax benefits, let's say tax incentives for benefit corporation, would you then suggest that it should be a broadening of the standing of other stakeholders?
So I would answer that question by pointing out that what you just said is one of the reasons why we've never asked for tax benefits.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think it's a perfectly logical response for the state, the government, to say, yes, we want to encourage your kind of activity. We will give you a tax benefit, but you then have to prove to us that, in fact, you're following through on your commitment.
Yeah.
And recognize that this whole effort came out of the United States context. And here, I think we concluded that there would be, again, a significant reluctance to sign up for a system where your economic for-profit activity is subject to potential regulation by the government.
Yeah, I remember that you said some of the Republican states or parties were actually quite in favor of this, insofar as it reflected the will and the intention of the owner of the businesses, and still didn't really have a role for government. Now, at this point, let me then go to BILA, because it almost feels as if it is filling a need, which certainly helps, let's put it that way, where the disclosure might not really be always perfect, and you might have some people who still abuse the benefit corporation for purposes that have more to do with marketing or other scopes, or where the ownership changes over time, and therefore there are risks in that regard. What is the role of BILA? Where does it come in? What is your experience with it or relationship with it?
So in the context that we have been discussing, B-Lab plays a very important role, because when a company is certified, its performance under the standards that B-Lab has established is available publicly on B-Lab's website. So you can look up any certified B corporation and see what its score was under the standards. So it actually then allows, in the case of certified B corporations, for verification and proof that the company is in fact living up to its commitments. Unfortunately, we have not yet evolved in our society and economic system to a point where we have in place a set of standards and a system for monitoring companies in a better way. So we don't have an analog to B-Lab for the rest of the economy. And in fact, we thought a long time about how to make the reporting obligation for benefit corporations meaningful, and recognize that the first statute was passed almost 15 years ago, And at that point in time, people were only beginning the process of trying to create reporting formats. About
Okay.
the same time that we were starting to develop the benefit corporation model, in the United States, an organization called the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board was established to try to fill in and create a system for reporting. That effort has now largely been absorbed into a broader effort to create global standards for reporting. And, at this point in time, the system is evolving.
Yeah.
And I hope that maybe in the next 10 years or so, we will have evolved to a point where we have a much better understanding of how to report, how to measure, and it's become much more systemized and accepted, a lot like generally accepted accounting principles. Uh, the
Yeah.
name itself
Whereas,
is kind of interesting because they're generally accepted, right? So what we need is a generally accepted set of impact reporting
well, on
principles.
general accepted and ethical, please, because frankly, we can
Yes,
talk about accounting standards too largely. We did with Colin Meyer about the fact that lots of the externalities are not included. We had a conversation with HR professors who told us that on the balance sheet you cannot have human capital for some good and many bad reasons, and so there are lots of things to say about accounting. And indeed, I think it's probably one important lever to make businesses better. But I want to go back to another thing, Bill. The way you got involved at the beginning, I'm just trying to
yeah,
go back to our first conversation, was so the B Lab already existed
yes.
at the point when you started to draw the legislation. So can you maybe just shed some light over what happened with whilst you were doing this work? How did B Lab evolve over the time frame?
Yes, B Lab already existed. B Lab was created in 2006, and I became involved, I think, probably by the end of 2007, and certainly was actively involved by 2008. What happened is that the initial effort of B Lab was to create a set of standards. And after they had created a first version and had thought about what the standards would look like, the founders of B Lab were learning more about the economic system, and they encountered the notion of shareholder value maximization, and they quickly realized that the legal system as it stood at the time was out of sync with what they were trying to accomplish through the standards that they were preparing. And so they mentioned that disconnect to one of my partners that had worked for them in the basketball shoe company, if your listeners remember the story. And I was introduced to them at that point to help them understand the problem that the law had created through the idea of shareholder value maximization and to think about an answer for it. And so that then led to discussions with them and my beginning to craft an answer. And then we worked through what it would look like. And the result was the benefit corporation model.
So whilst you were fighting the good fight in getting the legislation into the different states, are there, from your perspective, main evolutions in B Lab itself? At some point, it became international as well, etc. Is there something worth sharing?
Well, B Lab, yes, it became international largely as a result of the very first publicity that began to circulate, particularly within sustainable business circles. Again, remember this is back 2006 through roughly 2010. But part of the genesis of B Lab goes back to the attendance of the founders at Aspen conferences and
Mm.
other places where people were beginning to explore these ideas. And so as word got out about what B Lab was doing, people from other countries actually approached B Lab and said, we want to bring this movement to our country, help us to set it up and, affiliate with us. And that's how it grew. And the growth internationally was largely organic. It's very similar to the story I told you last time about the development of the statutes. And the history of the statutes is largely due to local interest. And similarly, the development of the global structure grew simply from local interest. So it was really South America that was the first international extension of B-Lab. And then it grew from there into Europe and other places as well.
And what about sorry, a bit on this side way, because maybe other people are not as familiar with the structure either. So we have B-Labs like charters at regional and national level. Is that the way? So we got a B-Lab Switzerland or a B-Lab Europe. Is that how it's working?
So at the moment, there are a group of about a half a dozen global partners. There's one for Latin America, one for Europe, one for Australia, New Zealand, one for Africa, based on the large collection of countries, largely by continent, although not completely. And then underneath those half a dozen global partners are operations in particular countries, again, where there is particular interest in the model and promoting it. B-Lab controls and owns the standard itself and controls and owns the trademark, the B in a circle, and the identification that companies can use to show the world that they're certified. And then B-Lab enters into contractual arrangements with the global partners and gives them a license and sets up the financial relationship, et cetera. And then the global partners contract with country partners. So it's like a tree with B-Lab, or maybe a pyramid would be more appropriate, with B-Lab at the top, then global partners, and then country partners underneath.
So you're already pointing to financial relationships. B-Lab, is it a benefit corporation itself? Is it a commercial venture? Is it a non-for-profit foundation? What is it?
Yes, B-Lab is a nonprofit corporation. So it actually has the status in the United States of what we refer to as a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. That's the same category that's used for most charities. And B-Lab is seen for tax purposes as an educational institution on a nonprofit basis.
And a final question on this, because we're getting into the monitoring of the certification. When I talked to our friend Marcello Palazzi here in Europe about the actual requirements for certification, he alluded to the fact that there is a standard setting body which is alongside the country B-Labs or sponsors for B Corps. So who is actually determining what the standards are, and how is that being updated?
The standards are controlled by B-Lab, the nonprofit. Actually, it's incorporated in Pennsylvania, tax-exempt charity. So ultimately, the board of directors of B-Lab has final authority. B-Lab has set up what's called the Standards Advisory Council, which is an independent group of people who have volunteered to monitor the development of the standards, to be very directly involved in revisions of the standards. And they do that purely on a voluntary basis, bringing their expertise. The people on the Standards Advisory Council come from a lot of different backgrounds, academics, business people, but again, have an interest in the whole idea of responsible performance by businesses.
Interesting, especially in the context of what you just said, the evolving disclosure standards. We just this morning spoke to Andreas Rasche, who was the assistant dean of the Copenhagen Business School, and we were talking about European sustainability regulation. And clearly there are kind of similarities, but also potential complications if companies have to report based on country jurisdiction on certain disclosure requirements, and then at the same time might have slightly different disclosure needs or standards set by the International Advisory Council, as you just explained.
Yes, we have a fair distance still to go. We've been working on it for a while, but if you think about it, in addition to what you were talking about in that conversation, there's the Global Reporting Initiative that's been around for quite a while. There's the UN Global Compact and its 10 principles for responsible business. I mean, there have been a lot of attempts to move in this direction. And what we're all hoping for is that we will soon be in a process of where all of these efforts start to coalesce into a more accepted and agreed framework that then can be really the basis for a global conversation about how we think business needs to behave. And we'll have, hopefully at some point, a standard baseline that will make that conversation easier.
Whereas, of course, going back to the spirit that I think you brought or tried to bring into the drafting of the legislation as almost something which says we shouldn't really try to protect the basics in terms of the minimum standards that we all commit to. We should really kind of rally the spirit of showcasing the best that business and humanity can do, right? So there's almost like, yes, we need to safeguard that nobody is abusing the brand or the type of corporation, but we should create exemplars of the best that can be done so that others get inspired and emulate these practices or successes, right? So there's both.
Yes, absolutely. There is in United States law a concept that we refer to as the laboratory of democracy. And it reflects the fact that in the United States system, according to the federal constitution, any powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. It sometimes seems like the federal government is in charge of everything, but the theory is that the states have the ability to decide what is most appropriate for them on many issues. And the classic example of this phenomenon is in the corporation laws, where in the United States we have 50 different corporation laws, none of which are absolutely identical. There are always local variations, and it's viewed as a process of experimentation. And so when something is introduced in one law, people immediately begin to ask, well, is this going to work? And they'll start to monitor its performance. And that was really the theory behind the benefit corporation. Because remember, when we started this, this was a really brand new idea. And we had no idea whether people would accept it and whether it would work. The fact that we've been successful in passing it in 40 states and we have probably tens of thousands of benefit corporations means that we at least have enough experience to begin to study.
Yeah.
Maybe not draw conclusions yet, although some of us have a sense of where things are headed, but at least we're seeing enough kind of examples and specimens that we can take into the laboratory to analyze.
Which brings us later to the last point in terms of the strategy going forward, because I think one big question, which you and I discussed in Rome recently, is the are we creating enough ripple effects? So what is the strategy to really change the economic system, if that ever was part of the kind of revolutionary idea, to take these mostly smaller organizations to create enough influence through their operations to really change the way all businesses run? But let's keep that for the strategy section. Okay. I want to go back to one point you and I also discussed, which was the public shareholder or public company shareholder aspects of B Corp. So I asked you once the question how many publicly traded benefit corporations there are, and you said it's actually a handful. And one list that you shared kindly was showing that many of these were actually subordinate to larger companies. So whatever Nestle, I don't know if Nestle has I think Nestle has a Nespresso probably.
Nestle has Nespresso as exactly. A subsidiary. Yes.
There are subsidiaries of publicly traded organizations which are B Corp. There are not many publicly traded B Corps. So can you just go into that? Is it because of size, or does it not make much sense?
It's size, although I think better characterized as complexity. But along with size generally comes complexity. So the larger the organization is, the more difficult it is to move these kind of concepts throughout the organization and address all the issues that need to be dealt with in order to be able, to prove that you can certify. And what we've seen is that the interest in certification, in other words, the B Lab certification, is fairly high, or there's a decent amount of interest from public companies, but when they begin to evaluate what would be involved, it becomes such a daunting task that it's one of the reasons why B Lab has developed a way of certifying just individual business units within multinationals. So we actually just mentioned the fact that Nespresso, which is a subsidiary of Nestle, is certified. Ben & Jerry's, as a subsidiary of Unilever, is certified. There are probably 10 or 12 at least certified B Corps that are within families of publicly traded companies. But to get the entire organization there is just extraordinarily daunting as a task, I guess is the way I would describe it.
Which almost begs the question as to whether the certification might need to be different for these very large companies. But I want to go somewhere else. You mentioned Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry was one of the cases where people suggested that the fact that they were benefit corporation, once being incorporated in Unilever, wasn't sufficient protection from shareholder primacy. So there was an idea that very often there's a conflict between the general kind of the shareholder primacy inside the economy vis-a-vis the balance that was implicit in the statutes. How did that play out in reality? Would you say that is a justified fear?
Ben & Jerry's is an interesting example because, as everyone knows, Ben & Jerry's, as originally created by Ben & Jerry, has always had this kind of commitment. And eventually, Ben & Jerry's was sold to Unilever. And at the time that it was sold, a lot of these further developments were still, just beginning. And so what was done was, in the terms of the sale itself, great lengths were gone to provide mechanisms to ensure that the Ben & Jerry's commitment to society and to sustainability, et cetera, would be respected and preserved, even though it was under the ownership of Unilever. I think it's interesting because Unilever's willingness to agree to those special relationships, I think, reflects the fact that Unilever understood that part of the value of what it was buying was the Ben & Jerry's ethos, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Their packaging was always very different. People understood that, their commitment to the farmers and to their product and everything about the way they did business was all part of the reason that people bought Ben & Jerry's. And so Unilever actually would have been foolish to destroy all of that. And I think we're seeing that phenomenon in other places as well, particularly as consumers become more conscious of these issues. And there are certain areas, obviously, in which consumers are more aware and more focused. A lot of it is in the area of food in particular, which raises its own interesting issues. But the hope is that this will spread, and this general understanding needs to be driven by society at large, and hopefully it will then force the kind of change that we're seeing in the big companies. But it's extraordinarily complicated and complex.
But you're almost saying it's the other way around. So we don't need to be worried that the um, benefit corporation statutes are not strong enough to withstand of the pressure of shareholder primacy across the economy, or even in companies where subsidiaries are benefit corporations. It's the other way around. It's almost like a guarantor for the independence of the ethos of some of these subsidiaries, which could spread and could ultimately become an ethos that is broader across the company or the organization again.
Yes, so we are trying to cooperate and be part of the more general effort to change society's awareness of these issues and the general attitude of society. But that ultimately will decide, I think, how successful we will be on the much broader issue of reforming our economy and getting it to the right place.
Yeah, whereas of course the two things are somewhat interdependent, right? I think there's some distrust that, especially with some of the B Corps just hitting the 80 points mark and then using it allegedly, let's put it that way, sometimes for more marketing purposes, or at least initially, then the trust gets eroded. So I think creating positive exemplars of benefit corporations could increase the trust, and therefore you get a self-reinforcing mechanism on both sides, right?
Yes, agreed.
But
And it's easier on the certified B Corporation side
exactly.
because there are procedures in place if there are issues that are raised about a certified company and complaints are received. B Lab has a process to evaluate and respond to those concerns. That
Let's
does not
go.
exist for benefit corporations.
Let's go. Let's go there. So for benefit corporations, we have, let's call it a limited accountability mechanism. So the legislation requires, or the model benefit corporation legislation requires annual benefit reports, but the general critique is the lack of independent verification and relatively weak enforcement mechanisms. And we already heard that the standing to sue is limited to normally the shareholders and directors. And I cannot imagine that having happened very often, frankly. So if we now go to the enforcement mechanisms within B Corp, how does that work? So let's assume I'm not convinced that a certain company is fulfilling their obligations towards the environment or society. What happens then?
If B Lab receives a complaint about a particular certified company, there is a staff within B Lab that is in charge of investigating, preparing a report, and making recommendations as to what should happen. And it can go all the way from just, a requirement that company engage in certain remedial efforts in order to maintain its certification, all the way up to a decision to immediately revoke certification and not even provide an opportunity to change
How's this
behavior.
done? Behind closed doors, some internal people taking decision? How is this
It
public?
begins with a complaint that comes from outside B Lab. Then an internal staff begins the investigation. The company is involved, and they are given eventually a draft report, which they can respond to. The process, we often see companies submitting written responses and agreement to certain issues and disputing the correctness of other allegations. And then there's sometimes for the larger, more complex issues, there's a period of negotiation and discussion, and we will sometimes see companies voluntarily surrender their certification, or depending on where they are in the life of their certification, if they're near the point where they need to recertify, they simply will drop out and not recertify. Or there will be remedial measures that are agreed to. Those will then actually be posted on B Lab's website so that people can see the results of the investigation. So generally, I think it's fair to say that at the end of an investigation, there will be some indication, either on B Lab's website with a description of remedial efforts, or the company dropping out of the community through one of a variety of scenarios. Or there will sometimes actually be press releases issued that reflect the final conclusion on a matter. We sometimes see consumer organizations and others bringing complaints and challenges and making their complaints public. And we take all of that very seriously and do not ignore any of those complaints. Sometimes we actually hire outside experts or forensic accountants to go in and look at what's going on. It's interesting to realize that, B Lab has been certifying companies for, at least 15 years at this point. And there have been issues that have arisen.
One question I have is, so there must be a difference between a company that is certified with 80 points and one that has gotten close to 150 points. So am I complaining, so to speak, against something that the company certified to, which was a specific requirements, let's say, to reach 120 points? Or am I more generally complaining about a kind of whatever, a lack of market? So something, you know what I mean, like a general.
Yeah, so the complaints are almost always tied to specific issues or behavior that people outside of the company have become aware of. For example, the BBC ran a series of, I guess it was blog posts and investigations about a company, and that created obviously a lot of attention and required response by B Lab. In other places, there have been folks that are involved, particularly in the food industry, with issues about plastic packaging, also issues of animal husbandry and how animals are treated. So an anti-vivisection league, for example, at one point surfaced against a farming company, actually an animal husbandry company, meat source. And that all reflects particular issues, sometimes with a particular company's behavior, and sometimes actually just with the nature of the business that the company's involved in. So about 10 years ago, there was a special study that resulted in a uniquely tailored set of standards for private colleges and universities, because there were several of those that certified. And so they were treated under a separate set of standards because B Lab realized that with companies seeking to certify in that industry, or as a result of complaints, we realized that there were issues that needed to be addressed. And that's the same thing in other industries as well.
Yeah, very interesting. I just wondered, for me as a consumer or even as a person interested in B Corps, it's not so evident to understand whether a certified B Corp has committed to a different sets of standards or practices at an 80-point level of quality certification vis-a-vis 150 points, and whether I can ascertain that the respective probably higher and more rigorous standards at the higher end of the certification are fulfilled. What you're describing is actually, no, it's a binary. So I have certain expectations in terms of the nature of the company, the nature of the behavior of the organization, if it bears a B Corp logo, and that's probably where the complaint comes in.
Yes.
Which brings me to one point that we mentioned in the first section, where you said there are no categories of products or services which are excluded a priori for benefit corporation. So be that cigarettes or nuclear weapons. So there's not necessarily a restriction in terms of categories. And as I mentioned in our pre-conversation, we recently came across a company that couldn't certify here in the UK because they had relationships with the prison services in the UK. So a contract with the government, which happened to be related to prisons. And they said for BLAB Europe, that wasn't acceptable, or BLAB, whoever was the certification authority in that case, it wasn't acceptable. So I would just wonder, does B Corp then have certain categories of products or services that are excluded from certification if that is not in the statute?
B Lab began without any exclusions. Over the course of time, a number of industries have been identified as requiring their own standards or special attention. And there are certain industries where there has never been a certified B Corp. You just cited one example with private prisons or prison services, firearms, tobacco. We will see what other issues begin to come to the fore. There are other industries, for example, fossil fuels, right? Which raise extraordinarily challenging problems. There's not been, obviously, a major oil company that's ever certified. Hard to imagine that there would be, frankly. So yes, there's, all of this is evolving, I guess, is what I would say. And at some point, if somebody in a suspect industry, really wants to certify, it will be an interesting challenge to figure out whether it's appropriate to certify them.
Yeah, which brings back the conversation that we recently had with a cardinal in the Vatican about faith-based investment based on Mensuram Bonum by Pope Francis, where certainly the Catholic Church put in place a whole list of industries they would exclude from being good in regards to Christian investors, right? And it's an interesting question. And of course, for the church, it might be things that have to do with birth control or gaming, but certainly energy companies are on that list too, right? Which created big challenges in the US, where the bishops in the US didn't want to accommodate that request from Rome. But indeed, like you say, I think that's very interesting. So maybe to close off our point number 4 in terms of the compliance and certification practices and challenges, with your oversight that you have, Bill, and I think you're really unique in the not only the engagement but also capacity to look at this from an arm's length perspective. To what degree has it worked, would you say? Is the monitoring that came on top of the, let's say, national monitoring through the B Lab, is that now at a state, you would say, of maturity where, yes, we need to work further on harmonizing the disclosure and learning from others, but is it working well? Also reflecting on some of the critique where people said that companies only get 80 points, get the branding and still do greenwashing, so to speak. What's your view?
So my view is that it has worked better than we originally thought it might. A lot of wiggle words in that statement. We weren't sure that it would work at all. It has worked. I think it's established. I don't think it's a movement that will go away or be rejected, but I also think we have a long way to go. And for example, right at the moment, B Lab is in the process of finalizing a completely new set of standards where it will no longer be just an 80-point bar. It will be a very different approach where there will be required performance in certain areas. At the moment, under the current system, you can get your 80 points anywhere you can find them and maybe
trade-off.
not get any points in certain areas. That will change. So there's a lot that's going on as we learn more. And I personally think that it's been very useful and beneficial for society to have done what we've done already, and we need to continue to.
Yeah, you remind me of a set of studies that we looked at last year in the UK, where indeed there was one of the critiques was you could trade off areas against each other. So you could make up more points in one and then seriously lack in another, but then averaging out the points or counting up and adding up the points you could still certify. And I think that certainly sounds like an important thing to address. But I'm very curious to see what BLAB comes up with in terms of a new approach. As you point out, it's a complex question, which maybe then brings us to where are the most important gaps vis-a-vis your vision to pursue real social value as opposed to just profit maximization? Where do you feel, from a legislative standpoint, or from the standpoint that the legal envelope was created, where are the strengths and weaknesses? Where are we?
So the issue that I find most interesting and am most engaged in is the question of how do we spread the vision for responsible business much more broadly across all of the economy. At the moment, the BLAB system and the benefit corporation models both are focused on highlighting companies that are willing to really move into the forefront and to provide an example and an inspiration for others. But eventually, we're going to need to create a model that will work or that can be imposed or is appropriate to be used by all businesses. Okay. And that's what I'm most interested in. And my own view is that the benefit corporation model and the BLAB approach are not exactly fit for that purpose. On the benefit corporation side, for example, the requirement that every business have a purpose of creating a material positive impact on society and the environment, I think is unrealistic if it were to be applied to all businesses. I'm coming to the view that what we really need is to focus on reducing external costs. I personally think that there's no reason why society should not insist that a business not impose external costs. So that's going to require a lot of thought about how to price external costs and how to monetize and reflect in financial statements the true costs that a business imposes in its products, because we really don't do that at all. And that's actually not my area of expertise. I'm a lawyer as opposed to an economist, but I think that the law eventually should reflect an understanding on the part of society that external costs need to be eliminated, and we need a system that will permit us to do that. And if we successfully do that, I think we might be able to say this is what the system actually should look like, and that's enough.
But are you trying to make man good by law, where in reality, as the gospel tells us, we are the first neighbor, right? In the gospel of the Good Samaritan, there is no external to us. The moment we're already creating the problem if we're treating anything as external, as we always said, right? So the problem of individuals treating themselves as separate from the system is that it immediately creates externalities, and then you're always chasing behind those externalities and trying to somehow bring them back into the cost base. Is that the right approach?
The problem that worries me that I've not seen anybody come up with a good answer to is the enormous hydraulic pressure built into our system from the amount of money that's
Oh, yes.
sloshing around and being chased by billions of people.
But here, your own approach, which was, as you pointed out, mostly pulled pulled by people who wanted it, but also ultimately pulled by people who often wanted it, but who didn't want to get their work controlled by the state. Whereas what you're saying now, either way, would require much more rigorous controls and red lines to be drawn in terms of what activity is allowed, and ultimately poses the question as to whether we can afford growth, right? As in growth, at least in a way that is consuming raw materials and producing waste, right? So we're coming to a much greater societal problem.
We're coming to an enormous problem that is way beyond my expertise, but definitely worth you or someone else tackling. Look at the fact that our world population is heading toward a peak within probably your lifetime, right? 2050 is going to be the maximum world population, and it's going to start heading downward at that point. And how do you run a system that's built on growth?
Mm.
I don't, that's going to be extraordinarily challenging as the number of people shrinks. How do you run the housing industry? How do you invest for the future? If you're in a degrowth society, what you have to do maybe is to make the value of what people have set aside actually grow in value simply because it does more, but it's not a question of growing, it's a question of a dollar buying more 10 years from now than it does today. But how do you prepare for retirement in a shrinking world? I It's way beyond my ability
Well,
to.
whereas I think in many of the degrowth conversations we're having, people like Matthias Schmelz are always pointing out that a degrowth in terms of material consumption doesn't necessarily imply that there's a degrowth in terms of value or social benefits or prosperity, right? So I think there's a necessity to maybe reevaluate things that we value today, or maybe find ways to simply reduce the throughput of materials.
Oh,
But
I agree with all of that, but how do you do that? And
yeah,
how do you change the way everyone saves for retirement without growth and investments?
and a system fueled by debt. I think this is going to be a conversation that is going to keep us awake, and I'm looking forward to further conversations next year when we meet up again. But I want to close us out with some reflections on B Corp in that context. So maybe then taking this challenge that you're laying out, where the B Corps could play a very important role in providing the exemplars of businesses that take the mission seriously, in influencing public opinions, but also sometimes larger companies, and maybe also enabling a battle for some stricter provisions in general requirements for all corporations, right? So if we just play with that for a second, how do you envisage it would be possible to do that? At the moment, I don't see a lot of this systematic building up of B Corp in that sense.
So one thing that we've actually not touched on in our conversation is the fact that there are two proposals that have actually been made already to make the benefit corporation model mandatory for all businesses.
Yeah.
So in the United Kingdom, there's an effort to promote what's called the Better Business Act, which would make benefit corporations the model for every UK business. While a lot of people would like to see that, my sense as a political matter is that that will be a long time coming. This same type of proposal has been proposed in Canada with the 21st Century Business Act. And that legislation actually is in draft and has been introduced by a legislator in Canada. What I find interesting about that proposal is that it is done on the background of a system in Canada, which is different than certainly what I've lived with all of my life, and I think in most countries as well. In Canada, a business has the choice of incorporating either under provincial law or under federal law. So every one of the Canadian provinces, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, et cetera, has a corporation law. And there is also a federal corporation law, and you have a choice
Oh,
of one or the other. There is a benefit corporation law in British Columbia at the provincial level. What's interesting is that the proposal to make benefit corporations mandatory under federal law is a less radical step than what's been proposed in the UK, because it would not force everyone to immediately live by the benefit corporation model. It would give you an opportunity and would, put the Canadian government at the federal level on record in support of a more responsible approach. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we may see something happen there. But again, it's a pretty far-reaching change. But we'll have to see as time
there's
goes
some
on.
strategy. So there's a strategy to create a benefit corporation law in a jurisdiction, and then to gather support in a broader change movement style to actually establish that law as applicable to all, at least new businesses or all businesses that get
Yes,
incorporated. So
yes.
I think that is already a very intriguing thought, which I am, and I feel kind of quite friendly to the B Corp community and their endeavors. I
Well, we're
haven't.
glad to have you as a friend. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I have not, and I mince my words very carefully here. I haven't really seen that systematic planning, engagement, strategizing where companies need to not only be interested in their own business and making it certified and surviving as well as thriving, so to speak, but also become part of almost a, let's call it a political economic movement, where together they try to shape the way that the country works in terms of the economy. Is that something
Yes,
that needs to be shaped?
that definitely is something that I would love to see. Does not exist now. In fact, the world is moving in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Years ago, 2019, the Business Roundtable in the United States came out in support of a more responsible view. BlackRock and its CEO, Larry Fink, were very vocal in promoting these ideas. And now, at least in the United States, the movement is exactly in the opposite direction.
Yeah, that's what Andreas told us again this morning. And secondly, we've seen several studies which showed that the BRT declaration actually didn't yield any significant changes in corporate governance. And hence, I think even there, whilst it was a very positive declaration, I remember being in Davos that year, where Greta Thunberg came to suggest that we were smoking something really strange if we thought we'd fix the problems that we'd created ourselves. And I think to a degree we're still in exactly that state.
Well, I mean, but even if it wasn't, ultimately helpful, the notion that we backed away from it is even more depressing. It would be, if you think about it, it would be better if it were still out there and accepted,
Yeah.
and there was still pressure from BlackRock and other large investors to move in that direction. But now the movement is in the wrong direction.
And if you look at, certainly in the climate change debate, if you look at some of the latest statistics, it blows my mind that someone who is healthy in their brain can still not acknowledge the necessity to move into that direction. Now, going towards, I think we're getting to the time boundary, Bill, and I don't want to drag you much further into your morning. But so I'm making a note of, so one, there's a potential strategy evolving here in terms of creating legislation, and we discussed it a little bit. There are different legislations. You talked about Rwanda and France not being entirely in line with the legislation that we discussed. But let's say we bring the legislation in, we rally the right people around it, and we try to lobby for further changes that actually impact everybody, rather than trying kind of to go all grassroots, certifying one business after the other, trying to somehow certify even larger companies where the majority of assets, the majority of FTE employees are. That sounds like a very lengthy discussion, considering the very small percentage of assets or employees that B Corps currently hold. Which jurisdiction would you go to next in establishing B Corps to start with, or benefit corporations to start with? And what would you suggest the role of B Lab is in shaping this broader societal movements? It seems to be more of a technical advisory at the moment than a social movement shaper.
So there are a few countries that are considering the benefit corporation model at the moment, but what we have found is that there are not really that many countries where the benefit corporation model is needed in the way that it was in the United States back in 2010. What I mean by that is that whenever we certify a company in a particular country, when the company is certified, they agree to change their corporate governance, either to become a benefit corporation or the local equivalent of that, or to amend their corporate charter to include the benefit corporation type of commitment. And what we found recently is in the other countries, the laws are much more receptive to companies by their own private action building this kind of framework into their corporate documents. And so it's not needed to change the actual law itself because the law permits this kind of commitment. So where the law in a country already permits the company to adopt this by private ordering, our focus is not on that. It's more on building the B Corp community, and it's more on the more general societal change. So I don't think that we will see a lot of new countries adopting benefit corporations in the next few years, because they just don't have the legal problem that we did in the United States.
But would then, how in that case, would your second step in the plan look like, where you say, we would want to formalize those requirements for all companies? So how would that work then? Would you then enforce
in that case, we would need a change in the law if, rather than it already being something that the law accommodates, we want the law to require it. Then we would want to move into legislation everywhere. I don't think we're at a point where that kind of legislative effort would have a reasonable chance of success.
I mean, the interesting thing would be, and it goes beyond this call, to ask ourselves, is there some country, whatever, Finland, right? So New Zealand, is there one country in the world where if you break the ice, so to speak, and create a precedent which could actually help, and Canada, of course, could be an equally good idea. But I wanted to ask one final question in this section, which is, again, we talked a few times about the fact that you didn't insist on tax credits or any incentives, at least from the state, in fostering benefit corporations, and for good reasons. But I still wonder, now, leaving aside the potential to create a different legal mandatory requirements for all companies to become benefit corporations, should we not at least create incentives or disincentives for non-benefit corporations through fiscal instruments or other instruments? I cannot see why that wouldn't be a highly pertinent strategy as well.
I think that's a very interesting strategy. If, for example, as a condition of doing business with the government in a country, you were committed to these principles, either because of a legal form or included in your corporate documentation, Yes. Again, the only problem is that it then raises the monitoring issue, where the government will be, then looking to make sure that you comply.
Yeah.
But at least for public companies, if we can get to the point where we've got good reporting for impact, then you can largely rely on the disclosure system.
Well, there
And
might also be, just thinking out loudly. So one, why wouldn't all the publicly owned or kind of regionally owned companies fall under this requirement? I mean, this maybe the state-owned companies or state-run businesses, that's probably the wrong word, services should go first in this. And then, like you say, public
yeah,
procurement.
we already have examples of that. Like in a number of states and federally, you have to use a certain amount of steel produced in the United States, right? That's the kind of mechanism. Obviously, it would look very different, but you could impose that kind of a requirement.
At least, I mean, in some jurisdictions, the state budget is 30% of the economy in terms of value, right? So I mean, just having public procurement and public services work into that direction could be a great lever.
Yeah, the problem is what we're seeing in the United States at the moment is a number of states that are restricting how their state funds are invested, particularly public employee pension funds, where the states are saying they cannot be invested with an eye to ESG issues.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, again, it's the exact opposite of what's going on. If we could change things so that the states became a force for investing in sustainable businesses, effectively reversing the counter ESG trend at the moment, that would be a great thing.
Or indeed insist on sectors that are directly related to climate problems or so on. We could say,
Yeah,
okay, food and energy and so on. Very interesting. I think, I mean, how much to think about. And what I love about what you're doing, Bill, is the personal effort that you spent into this is just worth a big applause, even if we're in virtual settings. Secondly, I think it has been a great success, but it is not enough of a success yet to make put a dent into the universe, right? So there is a
right.
need to take this, let's say, initial spark that I don't want to call it initial, this spark that you've created. It needs to become a flame in order to ultimately have the impact that is needed to shift, right, the system. And I think that's what really would require and be worth of some further thinking in the B community. In this regard, Bill, if we want to close this off, what is your call to action for people who are in the B Corp community, companies who are affiliating, so to speak, with B Corp, whether they're formally certified or not? What is your call out to those folks to say, we need you on board? This is what I want you to do. What would if you had a magic wand, so to speak, what would
Yeah, so we need you on board. We specifically need you on board as promoting to your employees, to your consumers, and in all of your advertising, your commitment to responsible behavior. So part of your value to society is the products that you provide, which people need, which contribute to our prosperity. But you make a point of pointing out to people that you are providing those products in a way that is sustainable, responsible, obviously framed in the terms of each particular product or industry, but really trying to make or to normalize, I guess what I would say is to normalize the expectation that people, when they buy products from a business, are buying because they know that it's been properly produced in a responsible way.
stand up for what is right is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
And I think make it known. I think that's a brilliant call out. And that might enable the community to punch above its weight so that it becomes normal to hold people who don't do that to account, right? I think that's the other side of the
Yeah,
coin.
and advertise it not as something special that you're doing, but reflecting your commitment as a business to operating in a system where that's expected behavior.
Brilliant. Bill, it's been, as every single time, it's been a fantastic pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time. We're close to Christmas, and with all the hushing and rushing and so on about, I want to thank you a lot on behalf also of Antoinette, who sadly couldn't make it due to a last-minute commitment, and everybody else. And I please everybody who's listening and watching to this, maybe use the Christmas time, which is coming, to think about how we could help Bill's vision become truer. I'm not even saying fully true, but truer next year. The time is calling for businesses to become responsible. If we look at how the world is, I don't think we can get away from stepping up, as Bill is suggesting. So thank you very much, and hope to speak to everyone again soon. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, Otti.